It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that answers the question, what would queer Jesus look like in a sports coat? Joining me, of course, tonight is La Bianca.
Hello.
And our very special guest, we are joined by Dr. David Lay. Doctor, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about Dr. Lay's books. We're going to be talking about hot wifing and cuckolding and incels and all of the deep, dark, creepy corners of our sexuality and of the internet and all of these different ideas. So we would love to hear from you, the viewer. Please give us a call. We're here at 512-686-0279. That number again is 512-686-0279. We're very excited to hear your questions and your thoughts on this kind of interesting aspect of our humanity. And I guess I'll go ahead and jump right into it.
Well, let me pause you. Let me bust you a little bit.
Sure, let's do it.
So why you gotta say these dark, creepy kind of corners of our sexuality? I think that we do that instinctively, and I find myself doing that as well, because we want to kind of apologize a little bit. We want to distance ourselves a little bit from some of these more challenging shadow aspects of our sexuality and our personality. And I don't think
certainly
we need to
agree with
that.
that. Yeah, I'll certainly agree with that. And I guess I'll kind of explain to the audience where my thinking is coming from, is that this is so often something that our society, our culture, all of these pressures kind of push into the corners, kind of push away from things. And so what we're talking about here is generally, in particular, men who are in seemingly or theoretically monogamous relationships with women who are then having sex with people outside of the relationship. And we'll get into the definitions of cuckolding and hot wifing and all of these sorts of things, but that's not really something that you can generally do in a public space. And I don't just mean the act of sex. I mean that it's not something we can talk about or acknowledge in polite company, generally speaking. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think a good piece of what we're here to do something about tonight.
Yeah, I think sexual morality and such, these social expectations around, you're not supposed to talk about sex in public, you're not supposed to be sexual in public. If you do, then you're a pervert. I think that's part of the problem. I think that what has happened is that we have this idea that, there's a certain kind of safe sexuality that we can talk about, heterosexual monogamy for the most part, and everything else we keep secret. But unfortunately, it turns out there's a lot more of that everything else than there is, frankly, of what we think about as normal kind of sexuality.
Yeah, so to that end, I guess I'm wondering why cuckolding is seen as so traditionally shameful. If jealousy is one of those sort of natural, intuitive emotions that most people seem to generally understand, why is this such a kind of specific phenomena?
So let me tell you a little story about the birds and bees, okay? Actually, just birds, no bees in this story. So the cuckoo canolus is a little bird that does this really interesting thing. The female cuckoo comes in and flies into the nest of another bird when that other bird is gone, and the female cuckoo lays its eggs in the in this other bird's nest. The cuckoo eggs hatch earlier than this other species. And then the baby cuckoo birds do something even more interesting. They push out the other eggs and they eat the food that the other bird parents kind of bring to their eggs. And it ends up that the baby cuckoo takes over the nest, consumes the resources that were intended for these other baby birds. And naturalists during the 15 and 1600s, they saw this and they said, look, that's what happens when a man's wife cheats on him. that he might end up investing in children that are not his, and his resources might actually end up being stolen from him, and he could end up raising children that are not genetically related to his. So the word cuckold actually comes from the practices of this cuckoo bird, which were identified as something horrible and shaming. Evolutionary biologists and psychologists today would say that our stigma and our prohibition against female infidelity is related to this protection of our genes. Historically, it was about protection of property, about protection of resources, but it all goes around kind of identifying reproduction and female sexuality as property.
So this is really an issue of economics from a standpoint of sexuality as sort of a finite resource. It ignores sort of our more modern understanding that, we are not pieces of bubble gum that get chewed up or flowers that get trampled, but able to have vast numbers of sexual experiences without, I don't want to say without cost, because, there's time and energy in these different things, but there's not a finite number of sexual partners that we can have in a happy, healthy lifestyle.
Piece is, I think, valuable because historically it has only been a very few societies in human history where women were allowed to be sexually non-monogamous. Throughout human history, men have been allowed to be non-monogamous in many different circumstances, whether it was, King Solomon that had 1,000 wives, etc. But it was only in a couple of societies, the Inuit are one, Tibetan historical families are another, where and it was economic reasons that supported the ability of women to be sexually non-monogamous with more than one man. But in those societies, there was an economic justification for it. In the Inuit, for instance, the women controlled the household economy and the wealth associated with the family, while the husbands were off hunting. So you're right that the economics play a big part. And what's interesting today is that as female economic independence goes up, female infidelity goes up as well, because a woman who is caught being sexually unfaithful, if she's poor, she can lose everything and she's out on the street taking care of her kids in the gutter. But if a wealthy woman
Okay, well, we seem to be having a little bit of trouble with Dr. Lay's feed, so we'll be working on that. But V, so just kind of talk to me about being introduced to these ideas a little bit.
Yeah, having grown up very conservative Christian, these are not ideas that are familiar to me.
Sure.
Very, very interesting. And it's fascinating to hear the claim that people were always or mostly allowing men to be non-monogamous.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I've done a little bit of research on the Neolithic period, and around that time, 3000 BCE. And it was interesting to see because in that culture, that time, before the Indo-European tribes kind of came down from up north, it was very centered on female empowerment, and they ran the businesses, they ran the cities, they were the judges, they were the priests, they were the gods. So it's interesting to kind of see a shift in the way we talk about things, even all the way back to back then. Like, it seems like we're coming full circle almost.
Yeah, that our economics and our gendered sexuality seem really tied to one another.
Yeah.
Dr. Lay, it seems like we may have you back. Are you here with us?
It looks like I'm back.
Okay, you're back. Yay.
I apologize.
Yeah,
No, that is okay.
Well, we lost you for a moment, and it seems like we're already kind of talking around it. But you point out in your book, Insatiable Wives, which I definitely recommend folks who are interested in this conversation take a look at. But you mentioned that in addition to the economic complications and everything that goes along with that, that women actually tend to have a greater capacity for for sexual pleasure, and that has been an issue for the patriarchy for, as far back as we have historical documents. How has that sort of shaped our modern society as we understand it now?
What's interesting is that I'm in my book. I mean, I can't remember if I've referred to it explicitly in this way, but female sexuality and female sexual capacity is like a Ferrari engine, and guys are sort of driving a Model T. Um, it takes us a long time to sort of get worked up, and then we're done oftentimes much more quickly than women get tired of sort of sexual pleasure. Their ability to have orgasms far outstrips males. Um, Historically, many men viewed that as a threat and something to control. But there were some men who viewed it as something to celebrate and to really embrace. That was really the origin of my book, where I started talking about those men who looked at their wives' sexuality and thought, holy shit, this is really cool that I'm married to this person who has a Ferrari engine. Let's see how fast it can go.
Yeah. Yeah, well, with that, I mean, you mentioned that as economic independence increases, that female infidelity seems to also increase. So then why is it that we seem to see that men cheat at higher rates than women? Is that a cultural thing? Is that a biological thing?
So it's a good question. Infidelity is, very much a multifactorial kind of issue. It is affected by a lot of different things, genetics, environment, context, opportunity. What's different with men and women when it comes to infidelity is that men appear to use sexuality, and whether it's masturbation, pornography, or sexuality outside the marriage, as a way to feel better, as a way to change the way they feel, as a way to cope with negative emotions. Oftentimes, poor men cheat more than wealthy men. You can't really prove that by folks in Washington D.C. But what is very, very clear is wealthier men have greater opportunity to negotiate relationships. They have better self-control, perhaps. They may have greater communication and negotiation kind of skills. Poor men use sex with women outside the marriage as a way to feel like a king, as a way to feel like that powerful rich king who had all the wives and harem. And it's an escape from poverty. Females don't really seem to use infidelity in quite that same way. A female infidelity is more often kind of tied to wanting to feel attractive and wanting to feel desire. And what's interesting is that in my book, I interviewed all these wives and couples, and this one wife told me the story I'll never forget. She said, when a man outside your marriage tells you that you're hot and want to have sex with you, it really touches her. She says, when he says you're beautiful, it really makes you feel beautiful. And I said, what about your husband? He says you're beautiful too. And she said, yeah, but that's his job. And so by having these outside men treating her as desirable, it gave her this kind of validation um, of desirability and sexuality and femininity that she wasn't really getting within the marriage.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's a sense of power as well as just validation.
But is it okay for us to get that from sex? And that is one of the issues in our society, because we've unfortunately we've embraced this heavily moral idea that sex is special. We shouldn't get, we should only use sex for love and relationship and making babies.
Mhm.
But when we use sex to feel better, when we use sex to for recreation, or when we use sex for anything other than that, view it as cheap or potentially immoral or problematic or even unhealthy.
I
Yeah,
apologize. I'm kind of
that's
getting
okay.
over a little bit of a cold there.
Yeah.
But I find that absolutely fascinating. Are there other places or meaningful distinctions, whether in our biology or just in our culture, where our sexuality is significantly different because of gender?
Wow, you're gonna get me like shot. There, are we allowed to talk about gender differences? I'm sorry, I didn't get that memo. Um,
We've got 30
um,
people watching live. So
the difficulty when we talk about gender differences is trying to understand whether these differences come from within us, in terms of who we are biologically and genetically and everything else, and what comes from social influence. And the reality is that, female sexuality has been heavily suppressed by society, for millennia. And one of the interesting places where I really see some neat kind of difference is, um, male and female arousal to pornography. And so man and male sexuality responds pretty bipolarly to heterosexual or homosexual images. If a man is heterosexual and watches homosexual pornography, he rarely shows much physiological. But women, females, we show them pornography, of any kind, whether it's heterosexual pornography, lesbian pornography, gay pornography, women's bodies demonstrate physiological arousal in a way that men's don't. Um, what's interesting is that men often psychological arousal consistent with their biological. Women often don't. Women's psychological arousal is often distinct from their biological arousal. What that means is that women are, for some reason, not paying attention to the bodily messages that are telling them, I'm turned on right now. Men are very much attuned to that. Is that because of biology, or is that because women throughout history have been told, if you show that you're turned on, then you're a slut, and that's not allowed? I mean, I am by no means a Trump fan, but I noticed during the July 4th Trump rally or parade or whatever it was he had in DC, it rained, right? And his wife, Melania Trump, was wearing a white dress, and the rain made her nipples kind of prominent and apparent. And in the media, people made fun of her, and they said, "Oh my God, look at that! That's so inappropriate." Which is saying women's nipples are not allowed to be seen, particularly in an aroused state. And if they are seen, then there's a problem. Wouldn't that kind of message lead to somebody like Melania not wanting to admit being turned? And that what's really interesting to me is how much of that affects our psychological experience of our sexuality.
Well, especially when you have such a direct comparison between his behavior and hers publicly with regards to infidelity and sexuality and everything else. And that's a
And
whole can of worms that the entire internet is trying to tackle right now. So we can leave it at that, but it is really interesting to think about.
Mhm. Now, the interesting thing, and actually, I mean, I'm going to stay with that topic for a minute because, if you remember, there are naked pictures of Melania
yep.
all over the place. And Trump has not really seemed to be embarrassed by that or ashamed by that. That is actually not uncommon. And if you would throw up a picture of my book again, I will tell you the story of this book. So of candleism, which is the fetish of liking to show naked pictures of your wife or girlfriend to other men. We now have widespread epidemic candleism everywhere because there are millions of men who have naked pictures of their wife or girlfriend on their phone that they proudly show to their friends, and fellow men. Does Trump get some interesting kind of sense of excitement and pride from having this beautiful hot wife that other men want? And is that why it's not really embarrassing to him to have naked pictures of his wife floating around? Because he's like, yeah, I'm enough of a stud that I got this beautiful wife. That appears to be one of the significant kind of motivators to men who want to share their wife with other men, in that it makes them feel like the king, who has this beautiful sexual property in some cases that other men want.
I thought it was interesting. A lot of liberals online, progressives, leftists, whatever you call them, were sharing those pictures of Melania and being like, look at this trashy woman. This is the president's wife, and I'm so ashamed. And like they were using the fact that we had pictures of her naked as like ammunition against Trump. And I would comment and be like, come on, guys, like, this is not any better than anything else. Like, can you please find something valid to criticize? Because this is not valid. This criticism of her showing her body is not a valid way to criticize anybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it irritates me how quickly some of those principles go out the window. When we want to use slut shaming, for instance, as a way to attack other people.
Yeah, I'm another thing I'm really interested in is where this whole conversation we're having about men and women, we're not talking about cuckolding in the concept of infidelity so much as, I mean, it's a very gendered conversation, I guess is what I mean to say. There's not a whole lot of cuck caking or cuck queening outside of pornography. Is that really the case, or is that just sort of what it looks like on its face?
I would say that's kind of what it looks like on the face. First, you're right. I mean, what I think is really interesting, I wrote that book in 2009. And at the time, cuckolding and hot wifing was a relatively underground kind of phenomenon. There wasn't a lot of conversation about it happening. And just very briefly, I mean, I ended up writing that because I doing research, met these two couples who practiced this sexual lifestyle where the wife went off and was sexual with other men. The husband was monogamous and really excited by the wife's being sexual with other men. And And I will share humbly and honestly that my initial reaction was, that's fucking crazy. That can't be healthy. But what was really amazing was that both of these two couples were remarkably healthy. They had incredible communication skills. They had decades-long marriages, successful children, successful careers. By every measure, they were healthy. And I had to examine, why did I, as a psychologist, assume that this sexual practice must be unhealthy? And I realized that without noticing, I had allowed a lot of bias around female sexuality and monogamy to intrude into my clinical thinking. And I thought, well, I shouldn't do that. That's not good medicine. And so then I spent a lot of time interviewing and researching and ended up writing the book, kind of telling sort of where this came from. In the intervening period, and it is not my fault, in the intervening period, cuckold pornography and hot wife pornography and MILF pornography have become in the top 5 kind of levels of popular pornography online. And I think that there's something about that, because the pornography viewer really wants to connect with the fantasy that this woman, the actors in the film, whether it's amateur or real, are really enjoying it, and that they are doing it because they're so into it. And if you can imagine that she's the girl next door, that's why that segment in Hustler magazine was so popular, because the idea of the girl next door being a sexual dynamo was really, really exciting to people. And it's almost a little more exciting to people, especially men, than the idea that she's a beautiful porn star, that this is her living, and you can't really tell if she's acting or not. Well, you can't really tell if an amateur is acting or not.
All right. Well, fair to say.
Yeah.
Still working on the connection. But yeah, so this is really, really interesting material, and I'm very curious to hear about the changes, over the last 10 years since this book was written. But as we're working on the connection and working on getting Dr. Lay back, we do have some calls on the line. I'd love to jump in with Bob real quick.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Hey, Bob, you are on the air. What can we do for you tonight?
Yeah, so I'm in a monogamous heterosexual marriage, and I very much have a strong cuckolding fantasy, as well as I'm very much a closeted bisexual, so much so that that's the first time I've ever verbalized that. And
thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, it feels safer in this space where I'm anonymous. But both of those topics, with my conservative upbringing, religious upbringing, are extremely shameful and taboo. And I'm wondering, how do I feel okay with the fact that I have these desires that, due to the nature of my relationship, I won't ever act on, but are constantly existing in kind of my thoughts, my fantasies, desires, etc.
Yeah, well,
that's a good question.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I guess I would just start by saying that, we certainly wouldn't see acting out on those impulses or those desires as problematic at all. We can get into the how and why of whether or not that's the right choice for you, et cetera. But I think it's important to acknowledge at the very beginning that simply having a desire, having an impulse, is not anything that you need to apologize for or feel held responsible to.
Yeah.
Beyond that, though.
Yeah, I think a good rule of thumb for me is if it's not hurting anybody, yourself or other people, unless you're into that and it's consensual, then it's not morally wrong. It's amoral at most. Morality doesn't factor into it. It is what you think about. It is what you want, and that it's an is, not an ought, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would agree with that from my moral viewpoint. The issue I run into is my wife, although isn't fully still entrenched in that conservative mindset, still is holding on to a lot of that indoctrination. And for her, these types of things, if I were to either share them or if she were to discover these things about me would still kind of have a sinful feel, for lack of a better term, for her, and would potentially damage my relationship with her or her view of me as a person.
Yeah, and I definitely hear that even as we struggle to wrestle with these issues ourselves and to process them, to feel comfortable with ourselves, to feel comfortable with our identity and our sexuality, that we still exist in this very imperfect world.
Right.
And so that is going to be a challenge for you. It's going to be a challenge for all of us. I would also suggest that it's certainly possible, without knowing too much about her or her interests, that she may, if as you say, has gotten away from most of that thinking, but still you feel like she might have some kind of reaction to it, that it's very possible in a healthy and mature way to view something as valid without necessarily wanting anything to do with it, while still having sort of a negative reaction to it. I've used this example on the show before, but I would say that being able to perform a open heart surgery is an absolutely beautiful thing, that's a noble pursuit if we're going to attach any kind of morality to it. It's a wonderful thing. At the same time, I can't watch a video of a open heart transplant without getting queasy. It still creates a very visceral reaction in me. And that's not me judging anybody. Mm-hmm. That's not me saying, oh, I could never do that, or I don't want anything to do with that. Because, I don't want to ever be in a situation where I'm reaching my hands into a human chest. It's just not something I'm interested in having happen in my life. But I still think it's a wonderful thing. And so I would hope that, she would be in an emotionally mature place to be able to recognize the difference between that sort of visceral gut reaction to your interests, while still being able to intellectually say, hey, this is okay, this is fine, this is wonderful. I apologize, or I feel some empathy for you if you don't believe that that's really the case.
Yeah, I've been in relationships where partway through, my partner has come to me with something that I didn't think was morally wrong at all. I, as well, left that aside, but it still made me feel strange and weird. And so, I think that if you were to pursue this, which, why not try it out? I think it would be useful to just approach it knowing that, you're kind of going to have to renegotiate a little bit and be very patient.
Yeah, and it's very challenging for me to not be able to feel okay with that part of my life and who I am there. Mm-hmm. So it is something that I would love to be able to share and be open about. It's kind of scary to take that first risk, or that first jump, and feel safe doing that.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to avoid the, kind of the all trap in negotiating these things with our partners. Instead of sitting her down and saying, well, sweetie, I have already found somebody. He's on his way now. I have the camera all set up. The lounge, the couch in the basement is all ready for the two of you. Please do this instead of setting it up in sort of this all at once kind of thing, remembering that this is a lifetime of negotiation, and sort of acknowledging that, hey, this is an interest that I have. I'm not making any obligation to you. I'm just wanting to be open and honest and say that this is something I fantasize about, and maybe you'd be interested in fantasizing with me. Maybe you'd be interested in going out with your girlfriends to get a drink, and even though you didn't do this and this didn't happen, you text me and say, hey, I met a guy at the bar, and we sort of flirt through text messages as she creates this fantasy. Maybe that's not a thing that she's going to be interested in at all, and that's okay too, because her interests are certainly her own and valid as well, but I do hope that you would feel comfortable at least being open and honest about your own sexuality with somebody who's so important to you.
Right. And it could be also that she would be very into it and is also holding back because she's not sure how to broach the topic either. I think starting slow, maybe broaching it as a fantasy, or, hey, why don't we watch this piece of porn, that has this as a topic, and just see kind of how that goes before bringing it any further.
No, I think that's good advice, and thanks for chatting with me and taking my call tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
And, if you have a moment, it seems we actually have Dr. Lay on the phone line, so I'm going to go ahead and
perfect.
bring him in and just give him an opportunity if he has anything else to add. And it seems we've lost the previous call, so I apologize
can't have
for
more
that.
than one on at the same
Dr. Lay,
time.
are you on the line?
Yeah, so apparently this is not a polyamorous phone line. You're not allowed to maintain
Seemingly not.
two concurrent relationships. That's a shame, even if we do it openly and ethically.
Right?
Um,
But I don't know if you were able to catch much of that previous call, if you had any insight to jump in with.
A little bit. I guess what I would say is, one of the things that I really think it's important to do is to normalize this fantasy. And, Justin Lehmiller is a colleague of mine. He has a lovely book out called Tell Me What You Want that is a compendium and research around sexual fantasy. And what he found was really remarkable. He found that 45% of men report fantasy, at least at some point, about their girlfriend or wife being with other men. And so this fantasy appears to be remarkably common, so common that it is really, in fact, normal. So all those men out there who are worried that there's something wrong with them for having this fantasy, I want you to kind of put that away. What I will say, though, is that, and I really appreciated the way you were talking about the negotiation, helping to make this something that, the couple could share, normalizing it, taking away the shame. But also, that idea of, hey, it would be hot if you went out with your girlfriend and then texted me that something happened, even though it didn't, just because it would be a really exciting fantasy. That is a really sophisticated and well-crafted way for couples to kind of try this out, to try it out in fantasy. And many couples don't even need to make it a reality because the fantasy can be so exciting, nurturing, and connecting in and of itself. What I will say, though, is I do see some men, and it doesn't sound like your caller was one of them, I do see some men who are so interested in getting this kind of cuckolding experience that they almost kind of force or coerce their wife into doing it. And that is absolutely never healthy and a recipe for disaster. I've seen some men who even do things like, trying to get their wife intoxicated and then set her up with another guy. And this is just like catastrophe happening.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, that kind of pressure. And, on the one hand, I want to empathize with men who find themselves with what they feel is a deep, dark secret that they becomes very obsessive and that they desperately, desperately want to fulfill and that they're willing to go to these incredible lengths. But yeah, absolutely, when we kind of pull back all of the shame, when we take away this idea that this is a terrible thing that nobody should ever be able to talk about, it becomes a lot easier to approach these things in ethical and kind ways that don't involve, the rape of your own wife, of putting somebody that you care about in a dangerous situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's not exactly parallel to it because mostly it, in my experience, has involved more than one person with a body that was not male. But as somebody who identifies as bisexual, I've been put in that situation both as a third party and as somebody in a relationship where there was that pressure to be with somebody else for the sake of your partner,
right,
because it was something they wanted to see. And it is a very, very fine line between, okay, this is something that we would both be interested in trying out and we're not sure how we feel about it, but we'll move forward with that understanding. Or, a little bit more pressure, a little bit more coercion, which isn't great.
Right. Now, I love the way you said that in terms of, something that is for both of us. And, the research around non-monogamous relationships really finds that they work best when both partners are getting something out of it. And so, when one partner is going along with it to satisfy the interests or the needs of the other partner, it is rarely successful. It breeds resentment and dissatisfaction, upset. But if both partners can find a way that this is something that is really exciting for them, then it is oftentimes likely that they can negotiate a pretty healthy and successful approach to non-monogamy. What I find really, really interesting in my book, again, like I said, I interviewed all these couples and these wives. This was back before Craigslist got rid of personals ads, and so as I traveled for business, I would post ads looking for cuckold, not wife couples. They would send me naked pictures of the wife, which I really appreciated because a lot of these wives were very beautiful. But I said, really, I just want to sit down with you and I want to talk to you. I want to understand how you do this. I want to understand how you make this work in your life. And the thing that I just found so interesting was that the wives, and right now there's not a lot of research around the wives. There's not a lot of research around the women who engage in cuckolding. There's more research around why men have this fantasy. But the women, I think, is now a really interesting question about what did they get out of it and why did they do it? And what I heard was, women who were saying, wow, I didn't know what a sexual dynamo or what a sexual engine, I had and how sexual I could be. I heard one woman who told me that, as she had engaged in cuckolding and hot wifing and started dating other men, and her daughter, who was like 16 or 17, didn't know that mom was doing this, but said to mom, hey, what's going on? Because you have become really assertive and confident and really empowered in a really powerful way that I've never seen before. And so this wife who'd grown up in a really conservative town in the Midwest had just never embraced her femininity, her attractiveness, her sensual nature. And now it was coming out in a way that their daughter saw and was really impressed by. That story always stuck with me because the message is that this isn't just about sex. This is also about self-acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's almost as if sex is life-affirming and not this, terrible secret need that we should all keep quiet about ourselves.
How dare you say that? My God!
Yeah, seriously. I mean, you and I aren't going to have any clients anymore if this message keeps getting out. So to that end, I mean, you mentioned that it's been 10 years since you've written this book. Maybe it's the humanist in me, but I can't help but feel like some of these sort of awkward failings that a lot of couples have when they first come to these ideas come from the fact that they don't have anybody to talk to. They don't have any role models to communicate with. They don't have, good resources on how to communicate. They don't have therapists that are informed about these things and that are willing to not pathologize them. So to that end, do you feel like things are progressing in the right direction or maybe getting easier for these couples as polyamory and other forms of non-monogamy become more generally accepted or more talked about? They're more, even if these TV shows are flawed, they certainly exist more than they used to.
Christy, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is definitely a change in the social dialogue around a lot of these issues. Hollywood has put out a lot of movies, Hall Pass and Friends with Benefits and No Strings Attached, where now the idea of non-monogamy is being explored a little more publicly. Research finds that around 45% of millennials no longer view monogamy as necessary for relationships. Now, we don't know if they will feel the same way in 10 or 15 years because during the 1970s, a lot of the people that are now baby boomers, were exploring non-monogamy, and then they gave it up in the 80s, along with the AIDS crisis and Reaganism and everything else. So we don't know what kind of shifts are going to come in the future. But what we do see is that now there is just a lot more dialogue around these kinds of ideas. I mean, even Bride magazine had an article about polyamory just a couple of months ago. So there's much more acknowledgement that monogamy is not the end-all, be-all, only answer. Therapy, unfortunately, therapists remain a very conservative sex negative and awfully kind of judgmental industry. And I say that because I work with these folks all day long, and I do trainings around the country for therapists around helping them to acknowledge their sexual bias and the degree to which they unintentionally judge and shame their patients around sex. I hope that is changing. Your listeners and viewers, they can find non-judgmental therapists to help them with these issues. I recommend two main resources. One is the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. It's called AASECT, AASECT, and they have a listing of therapists that are specially trained around sexuality issues. The other is the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom has a listing called Kink-Aware Professionals, and that's a great way to find not just therapists, but also lawyers and other folks who are aware of the diversity of sexuality and don't assume that there's only one right way to be sexually healthy. So there's greater resources available to people, but what I really am finding interesting now is that more and more people are pushing back against shaming for sexuality in these interesting kind of public ways. And again, this whole show has been about politics, but my God, it's really interesting because Trump is surrounded by these interesting kinky people. Paul Manafort, who went to jail, obviously. There is a really interesting, relatively unacknowledged kind of expose about his sexual life, that he apparently really loved to watch his wife have sex with a whole bunch of black men. And then after the men left, Paul Manafort would have sex with his wife. And according to the information that we have, that was the best way that he could kind of get sexually aroused. And then Roger Stone, who is also one of Trump's main advisors, he has this notorious history of being a swinger, and he calls himself a trisexual, that he will sort of try anything. And there was this, again, kind of expose that he was looking for a muscular man to have sex with his wife while he watched. What I find really, really interesting in both of those stories, while I am not a fan of either of these men, I want to be extremely clear about that. Sure. Neither of them have been publicly shamed or castigated for these fantasies and behaviors that a few years ago, would have led to them being publicly stoned.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And it makes me wonder, as we see kind of more general acceptance, whether the people who are actually practicing these lifestyles or these different behaviors are in any way different from the general population. Is there anything demographically significant? You mentioned, high levels of communication skills and things along those lines. Is there anything else from your research that sort of stands out about who these people might be?
To make it work, to do this in a healthy way, requires a tremendous amount of communication, mutual respect, self-acceptance, the ability to explore the kind of sexual dark side with some dignity, and some connection. That is relatively sophisticated, however, and so we can see, unfortunately, we can see folks who are not very healthy who try this lifestyle or these kind of sexual expressions, and it crashes in a steaming pile of chaos.
Sure.
But I think that we blame the non-monogamy for that, but the reality is this relationship might have been doomed anyway because of those issues, those deficits, those problems. One other kind of factor in the men that we haven't really talked about that plays a really significant role here is male bisexuality, and that there is this really interesting phenomenon where men who don't feel like they can safely or socially express sexual attraction to other men because they grew up in a conservative, homophobic kind of culture. They end up becoming really, really interestingly obsessed with their wife being with men with big penises. And what I found really remarkable was that there's this cluster of these men, these cuckold kind of men, who are just obsessed with getting to see their wife with the man with the biggest possible penis they can find. And the wife is kind of like, okay, whatever, right? But the husband is all about it. And my argument is that these men are engaging in bisexual behavior with the other man, using their wife as a proxy, using their wife as this kind of vehicle for them to engage in sexual contact with the other man. A lot of cuckolds are really, really interested in, performing oral sex on their wife after she's been with the other man, and kind of consuming his semen, and they fantasize about that in all these really kind of interesting, sort of slightly obsessive ways. And at some level, these are guys who really want to be sexual with other men, but they can't safely, but they can through their wives. There's also this interesting kind of related offshoot in the cuckold world of then forced bisexuality, where then the wife forces the cuckold husband to then be sexual with the wife's other male lover, preparing him to have sex with her or things like that. And so again, what we see here is this way in which this fantasy is a way to overcome the internal kind of social and moral obstacles that we have towards enjoying the kind of sexuality we really wish we were allowed to.
That's interesting. I did not know that. I'm curious if you think that is, I don't know how to phrase this. Do you think that that's a useful way to look at it? Or do you think that making the possibility of bisexual tendencies a focus, we inhibit straight guys who then won't do it because, what does that mean about me? Are there strictly straight men who can also get off on this?
Well, I think that's one of the dangers of trying to get at the root of a sexual desire and running these things to ground. But at the same time, I do think that is one of the explanations. And I kind of wanted to ask you about another, if you can maybe jump in on both of these, is cuckolding a desire to kind of sexualize these fears, or is hot wifing a way to sexualize these fears of being cuckolded, these fears of being cheated on, and making it something that's sort of exciting and dirty rather than, scary?
What I'll say is that, this fantasy, this sexual behavior, it is so popular and common because it comes from a lot of different directions. And so bisexuality may be the explanation for one man and not the other one. The man who gets off on having the beautiful hot wife that the other men want to be with, he may not be coming at it from a bisexual kind of way, but he's coming at it from this maybe place of mild insecurity with other men and wanting to feel proud that he's enough of a stud that he got this beautiful wife. And so there's a lot of kind of different things that come into it. But Christy, your point is an interesting one for me. And so Dan Savage and I, are good friends, and we actually did research on cuckolding along with Justin Lehmiller, who I mentioned. Dan's theory, and Dan on his Savage Love podcast and the Savage Love letters or whatever it is, he has gotten, hundreds and thousands of letters from men who, want to see their wives with other men. And to the point that Dan even gets kind of frustrated with it, like it's too much. Dan's argument, his theory, is that this is an eroticization of fear, that the man is afraid of being cuckolded non-consensually. And I have to back up just a little bit, that cuckolding in modern day kind of practice is a consensual kind of thing. The husband wants the wife to go off and be with other men. Historically, the term meant, secret cheating, and it was really infidelity and deception and everything else. But Dan's idea is that these guys are so afraid of the wife cheating on them that they end up eroticizing it and using that sexual arousal as a way to overcome some of this, this kind of fear. It's one of the few places where I disagree with Dan, because we just don't really see it in the data or research. What we see is that the men and who are into this, they already have a pretty high level of attachment to their partner. They are actually not really all that concerned about losing her or about her, harming them or cheating on them by being with other men. And so it doesn't appear that this fear is kind of there. I will tell you that, I am not a fan of snakes, and, sexual fantasies about snakes do not make my fear of snakes go away. So I think the whole eroticization of fear thing is just kind of malarkey.
Yeah, that's an interesting, it makes me think instantly, and I have my own thoughts on why and how, but the concept of rape fantasies as well. I feel like assuming that a fear eroticized then eliminates the fear would be tricky to argue across the board just because rape fantasies also exist.
Yeah, that is a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up. About 60% of women will acknowledge a sexual fantasy of being, forced into sex, rape, or it varies the percentage you get by how strong the words are that you use. But only, as is a tragic word to say, even in this circumstance, 25% of women will experience, a sexual assault across their lifetime. So there are many women who are having this fantasy without ever having the experience of sexual assault. And, at least one theory that I sort of endorse is that our society idealizes and kind of romanticizes, forced sex, whether it's in 50 Shades of Grey or, even the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast, where the beast pounds on the door and she swoons in love for his overwhelming passion. That is, again, I'm going to circle back to what we talked about before about just different sexual response kind of patterns. That is something that kind of gets into our sexual psychology.
Yeah, also the idea that if it's forced, then the woman no longer has to take responsibility for it in a puritanical culture. I feel like that.
Yeah,
plays
yeah,
into
exactly.
That.
Yeah.
Well, and then just the simple fact that we see it so much in media, I think that is both a reflection on our desires, but also something that sort of normalizes and creates that desire. Because, how many movies in the third act, the man, after having been an asshole for the last hour and a half, shows up, grabs her by the arm, swoops her down and plants a big wet kiss, and it's supposed to be romantic, and the music swells, and it's beautiful, even though that was not a negotiated kiss in most senses. I have about a million more questions along this line of thinking, but I've got a caller on the line that I think has a question that is right up your alley. So I'm going to go ahead and jump on with James.
Yep.
Hey, James, you are on the air.
Hey, I've been watching the show maybe 3 or 4 times already, and I've got kind of an issue. I'm married, and I'm watching pornography, And I feel like, because I think it goes really well with this whole cuckolding fantasy thing, is like, I feel like when I'm watching pornography, that when I'm watching two people having sex, and the girl I'm attracted to and another guy having sex with that girl, is that I'm by nature of that whole thing, that I'm in the cuckolding position as watching the pornography itself. And so I think it's like rewiring my brain to where I'm thinking, that again, I think it's affecting me that way, and so I'm kind of nervous.
I guess, yeah, no, I hear that. I guess I just want to clarify. I'm yet to hear a problem so far. Is there? I mean, I'm not saying if this is causing you distress, then we'll talk about it. But what is this causing an issue? I need
some help. Like how can I stop? Because it's kind of like I kind of want to stop viewing the pornography. Mm-hmm. Because the way it's affecting me, and because I think I'm going to be a better husband, without that kind of thing around. And so I was wanting to know if Dr. Lay had any advice on how to quit pornography.
I think you asked the very best person that question, Dr. Lay. Let me give it to you.
So can you guys hear me? Because I know the phone system's a little.
Yeah, I think we've got that figured out.
You're good.
Okay, so. I really support men who want to be mindful about their sexuality, who really want to look at how to be conscious about how to integrate their sexuality into their lives and be responsible and ethical in that way. I actually have a book that your viewer might really enjoy. It's called Ethical Porn for Dicks, A Man's Guide to Responsible Viewing Pleasure. And in it, I talk about these kinds of issues, about the guys that feel like they're watching too much pornography, about the guys that, feel like they want their wife to act like the porn stars, or even they're struggling because they feel like they get turned on more watching pornography than with their wife. What I recommend, instead of trying to stop the pornography, because we as human beings are actually not really very good at trying to stop doing something, but we are pretty good at trying to change our behavior or at trying to increase other behaviors. So what I ask guys to do is, instead of trying to stop pornography, tell me what kinds of things you feel like you would be doing instead of watching pornography. Well, I'd be going on walks with my wife. I'd be spending more romantic time with my wife. I'd be talking to my wife more. And I ask the guys then, let's pay attention to that stuff. And we even can chart it out, perhaps. Sometimes I have worked with guys and I've said, okay, look, what if you only watch pornography one time for every 3 times you have sex with your wife? And so it's not that we are trying to completely stop or eradicate a certain behavior, but we're just trying to shift our attention and our energy towards the things we want more of. The other thing, though, that is really common in couples is that, there are men like your caller who feel like they are watching more porn and they're having less sex with their wife. Causality is an interesting issue here, because what the research shows is that typically what happens is that the couple stops having sex as frequently, or that the couple's sexuality changes, and then the husband goes to pornography, which is a vehicle for masturbation. We have to be very, very clear about that. Pornography is nothing more and nothing less than a tool to enhance masturbation in men. And so the man goes to pornography to masturbate more, to compensate for changes in the sexuality with the partner. So I encourage, again, before we start demonizing and blaming pornography for these issues, let us look at the context within which, this behavior is occurring, because, the system is really a big factor here that we have to pay attention to. So we need to look at how your caller is having sex with his wife, how frequently that sex is happening, how satisfying that sex is happening. Sometimes we can explore that we would be afraid to explore or share with our partner, because pornography doesn't judge us. Pornography is easy to turn on. To get the internet to have sex with you, all you need to do is push the button. It's a little more complicated when we're dealing with real people.
Well, and I love the idea that you pointed out of not trying to decrease the pornography, but putting a ratio to, having intercourse or having a relationship with your wife, because I think oftentimes we won't actually see the porn go down, but we will see the interactions with the wife go up. So often we think of our sexuality as being limited. And yeah, there is the tyranny of hydraulics. There is a certain number of erections and orgasms that most men are able to achieve. But I think most men would be pretty surprised at what they'd be able to accomplish if they had that kind of ratio or had that kind of incentive.
Yeah, for sure. Do we want to get James back on the line to maybe see what he's thinking about this?
Yeah, James, we should be able to hear you.
Oh, yes. Oh, good.
Yeah.
You are on the line.
Sorry,
Perfect.
I should be listening. Yeah. So I kind of get from that is I kind of should, maybe if I have my wife, have her permission to, not masturbate without her permission. Would that help? That way it's she's in complete control and I wouldn't have that whole, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I hear that, and I'll certainly let y'all respond. But to me, that still feels tied to a sense of shame or a sense of this idea of being maybe addicted to pornography or to masturbation, being unable to stop yourself.
I'm trying to eliminate the arousal from pornography so that my wife arouses me more. Because he kind of said, try to use it as an arousal tool. But I'm trying to think if I don't get aroused by 16 tens on all my favorite videos, my wife might, if they're always arousing me, then my wife, who, she's very beautiful, but, not 16 tens I'm a sultan, so maybe that's the whole reason why I want to cut out the pornography altogether, is so that my wife arouses me more. And then I'm more satisfied that way.
I feel like
I don't know. It's just sorry.
Yeah, I think that I feel like that might run the risk of that. It might work for a while, but I feel like that would quickly turn into resentment. And why aren't you letting me? And I have to go to ask for permission now, and it might complicate things more.
That was an example of I go to permission, basically saying I don't want to do that without somebody else, except so if I'm in pornography, I'm in the basement, just doing my thing, and my wife's up, in the bedroom reading a book, and it's it just seems like there's a better way. I think, I don't know. I try to go to therapists, and they say the same thing, there's nothing wrong. But I feel like there is. I don't know. That's why I'm trying to ask if you guys have any advice on this whole kind of situation.
Yeah, Dr. Late, let me give you a chance to respond.
So it's interesting how this kind of, connects to cuckolding in a way. There is a practice called female-led relationships, where men give their wife or a female dominant complete control of the male sexuality, and in some cases, the man even puts on a cage, a cock cage, so that he literally can't masturbate without her permission. One of the wild things is that some of those devices are like Bluetooth and internet enabled, so that your online dominant can unlock them remotely or lock them remotely. It's really kind of wild. I am not, however, suggesting that that is the answer here. Instead, what I really think would be interesting is if you sat down with your wife and asked her what she finds sexually interesting. I gotta say, it sounds like you are really, really focused on your sexual interest, your sexual arousal, your sexual experience, and I wonder what her interests are and how connected you are with that, because I bet that it would be a pretty arousing, erotic, and exciting experience for you and her if you asked her what her sexual fantasy is. Not a lot of women have the opportunity or permission to kind of express that or to share that. Men, because of male kind of sexual privilege, we have a lot more permission to kind of identify what we're interested in. 16 perfect tens, like you said. What is she interested in, and what would it be like for you to sit down with her and explore her fantasy? Or even, what kind of pornography does she watch? Or what kind of erotica does she read? And what would it be like to share that with her? Instead of trying to, instead of trying to suppress or stop or turn off your interest in pornography, let's try and turn up the dial on your interest in your wife's sexuality. Let's incentivize and empower that.
So I hope that gives you a place to start. I would definitely recommend some of Dr. Lay's books on these topics as you're kind of working through these things. And again, talking to a sex therapist who is going to be understanding of these kinds of issues and give you a more complex answer than, well, porn is fine or porn is evil, and, brushing it off from there.
Yeah, well, I try to go to religious therapists, because they're really against pornography. So I thought maybe that would help, and it didn't help at all. So
yeah, I can't say that I'm shocked, but okay, you get what you ask for sometimes. So.
Well, then I go to a secular therapist, and they tell me the exact opposite. And so, my urge to stop pornography is not coming from a religious, point of view. It's coming from, I think it would, make my wife happier and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I really need to, think this through.
Well, it very well may, but just, I guess, to wrap it all up, I would suggest that the problem here isn't the pornography. The problem here is the connection with your wife, whether that's her interest in sex, whether that's her level of arousal, or whether that's just your ability or interest or efforts in eliciting that arousal and creating that connection and developing that relationship with her. So I would really encourage you to focus more on the sex with her rather than the not. Like Dr. Lay said, staying away from trying to avoid things and instead running towards something.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But I
Very
certainly,
good.
Yeah, I certainly hope that helps, and I really appreciate you giving us a call.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Thank
take care.
you.
I'll just kind of comment there that, your caller is right that there is kind of a divide here between religious therapists and secular therapists around sexuality. And we have to acknowledge how morally complex sexuality is, because most of our kind of sociosexual rules come from, a history of morals that emerged from religion. And one of the places that we are now trying to turn things is by moving from what we call an act-based model of sexual health to a values-based model of sexual health. And, an act-based model of sexual health is really the religious kind of tradition that, sex outside marriage is bad, sex inside marriage is good. Penis and vagina sex is good, penis anywhere else sex is bad. That, heterosex is good, homosex is bad. These are act-based models of sexual health where the goodness of sex is defined on what you do. Instead, now we are realizing with the diversity of sexual expression that is out there, we're now realizing that it's not so much what you do, but it's more how you do it. And so the therapists and the clinicians and the thinkers that I'm really interested in, and this even includes religious folks. There is a group called the Religious Institute, which is a consortium of pastors and ministers who recognize that religion has not done a good job with sexuality, and they are trying to do better. They actually come to some of my trainings, which I'm, really kind of conflicted by. I enjoy them being there, but I always worry because I'm not a super religious guy. But instead, we are now starting to focus on how you do it. And so then the question is, well, what are the components that go into healthy sexuality? And, the right now, there is some consensus that healthy sexuality is sex that is honest, sex that is mutual, sex that is, safe in terms of attention to STIs and such, sex that doesn't involve exploitation, and sex that has some kind of integrity to it, so that we can have honest, shared value kind of sex, even if it is really super kinky, and it's healthy so long as we do so in a consensual, open, negotiated kind of way. The story I often tell is, if I'm at a hotel and I meet you at a hotel bar and we go, and I tell you, gee, I'm really looking for a long-term relationship and you seem like a wonderful person and we really are hitting it off and I'd love to try to have a long-term relationship with you. We go up to my hotel room, we have crazy hot sex. There's orgasms everywhere on the ceiling and splattered on the walls. But the next day, I don't call you because I knew you wanted a long-term relationship and I didn't. That might have been very, very pleasurable sex. It might be very, quote, good sex, but it wasn't healthy sex because I wasn't being honest and we didn't have shared values kind of going into this. Was it really even consensual, one might argue? Instead of trying to focus on what we do, let us focus instead on how we do it. And instead of trying to stop the sex, let's try to enhance the degree to which our sexual behaviors can be honest. And the term I talk about often is having sexual integrity. One of the things I really like about, the caller that we were just chatting with is that he is really trying to figure out consciously how to make his sexuality a part of himself and his identity in a way that he wants it to be. He's taking charge of his sexuality in his life. And whether I agree with him or not, I am impressed by that because I think it is a very existentially authentic thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful point. I'd never heard the comparison of acts and values laid out so well. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
With just the few minutes that we had left, I wanted to make sure to ask you about, I guess, again, some of the in this case, very much the darker, scarier corners of the internet, as we're talking about.
You can say creepy, Christy.
Yeah, creepy, sure. Well, things like the no-fap movement, things like the involuntarily celibate cultures that we see popping up on 4chan and Reddit and these different things. And I guess I'm curious if your research into hot wifing in cuckolding gives you any particular insights, or if there's anything you can share with us about why this seems to be such a growing movement.
Well, it's interesting. There's a little bit of a connection, but it's not really kind of the one that you might think. That, the incels and some of the alt-right, for instance, they are really, really triggered by the idea of cuckolding because they view it as, a sign of how weak a man is. Tucker Carlson on Fox News, like his head exploded when our research about cuckolding came out a couple of years ago, and it said that, hey, cuckolding can be healthy and positive for some couples. And he was just like, oh my God, the end times are here.
He says that about everything, though.
Well, if you can't call somebody a beta cuck snowflake, then how are you going to insult them properly?
It's true.
Yeah, that's right.
Problem.
The thing is that cuckolds, they're actually kind of in touch with their sexuality. It is these people who are slinging these threats and these fears and these panic kind of algorithms around. They are really, really afraid of their sexuality. They're deeply ashamed of their sexuality. And they don't know what to do with that. I taped an episode for The Daily Show that hasn't aired yet, and it's about the alt-right's fascination with trying to shame and suppress masturbation. And the basic premise of that piece and the premise of some interesting arguments is that by making people afraid of their sexuality, by making people hate themselves for having sexual thoughts, we increase the degree to which we can manipulate them and we can exert authoritarian control over their thinking. There's this remarkable research from Israel by a researcher named Yaniv Afrati, and he did this neat study where he looked at highly orthodox religious people and showed that the stronger their religious beliefs, the more they try to suppress thoughts of sex and masturbation. And the harder they work to make those thoughts go away, the stronger the thoughts become, the more frequent they become. And then, of course, the person hates themselves more, and they feel like they're an awful, immoral, doomed kind of person because they're having these thoughts that they view as immoral. And what's interesting is that you see all of these groups and incels, alt-right online, these folks that are just so angry about sexuality, and the no-fap movement especially, where they are trying to get people to obsess about not masturbating. And then they're surprised when it doesn't work and the guys end up masturbating. Gee, that's how psychology works. But by doing so, they're energizing, this very thing that we are, that these guys are struggling with. And I see a lot of guys who've gone to the no-fap movement and they've kind of tried it and they end up hating themselves and feeling ashamed. And what I say is similar to what I just said with your caller is, let's focus on the things you want more of in your life. Let's energize those things rather than hating these things that we can't do a damn thing about.
Yeah, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, this show and everything that we're doing here kind of all started with Dr. Ray's The God Virus, which really spends a lot of time driving this point home, particularly looking at Catholicism and some older traditions and the way that sexual shame is such a important tool of control. And I'd never really heard anybody make that comparison to sort of these more modern ideas of sex addiction and no-fap and all of this.
Oh, yeah. No, I was like, this all sounds very familiar to me.
Well, it's funny because Daryl, I did his podcast, several years ago, and I think that we met because I had a Google search, set up for the myth of sex addiction. That was my second book, and he did a presentation that was called The Myth of Sex Addiction, and I wrote him, and I was like, "Hey, dude, what's up? Why are you using my title?" And he sent me the presentation, and he had included, a reference to my book in it, and I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe you're all right then." And then we got to know each other.
Yeah, well, glad to hear it. I really do appreciate you taking the time to call in with us. I apologize for some of the technical issues that we're up against, but so glad to have you here. Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure to let the audience know?
No, your folks can find me on Twitter at Dr. David Lay is kind of the easiest sort of way to find me and get an idea of what I'm up to these days.
Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got links to that as well as your books and a number of other things in the footnotes for the episode.
Yeah, and
very kind.
Yeah, if you guys, again, want to check out Dr. David Lay on Twitter, that's at Dr. David Lay, and he's also on Instagram as David Lay PhD. Is that correct?
Yep, you got it.
Wonderful. And then if you guys want to continue watching this show, we also have a brand new Twitter account with like 50 followers. So come help us reach the 100.
It's brand new. We're way better than 50 followers. It's kind of embarrassing right now. So if you guys could,
Anyone who's been on Twitter understands this. It's fine.
the first bit, yeah.
So that's at Secular Sex. And then you can also search us on YouTube, Secular Sexuality, and the ACA in general has Discord, Facebook, Reddit, all the ways to get in touch with us there.
So, yeah, we hope that you'll keep the conversation going and hop into the Discord or shoot us an email. We're sex@atheist-community.org. And I guess until we see you all again, we just want to thank everybody for tuning in and remind them to go out and give themselves a big old orgasm. Or better yet,
give somebody else one.